Hello, my name is Gordon Wallace.
Where and when were you born?
I was born in Cairns, North Queensland, on the 7th of the 11th, 1921.
So how old are you right now?
Now I am 97 years of age. I will be 98 in the 7th of November this year.
Do you feel that you're 97? What does that feel like?
No, I don't. I don't feel I'm 97. I've generally had a youthful outlook on life. There's so many wonderful things to do irrespective of your age. And, and I've got a lot of kids and grandkids and that keep me busy and keep me interested. So that really and truly age is just a number.
What branch of the military were you in during your time in World War II?
I was in the infantry. I was in the 2nd 15th Australian Infantry Battalion, and eventually we became part of the 9th Division.
What company were you in?
B Company.
And what platoon?
12 Platoon.
What was your specific role in 12 Platoon?
Well, I was an acting corporal when we left Australia, and I was a corporal right through the Tobruk campaign.
Where all did you see combat during World War II?
Well, in the first, I was first fired on around Mercer when I was burying our first casualty, and then in Tobruk when the Germans attacked in the Easter battle. And from Tobruk we were there for 8 months, and then we were taken out for rest and recuperation, and then to Alamein when the 8th Army was in trouble.
And from Alamein?
From Alamein we came back to Australia. We had, I think it was 3 weeks leave, and then we went into jungle training, and from there we went to New Guinea. And our first function there was the landing at Lae. It was the first time there'd been a ship-to-shore landing by Australians since Gallipoli. Lae was not a very heavily defended area by the Japanese. We landed at Red Beach, and in the 7th Division landed in the Ramu Valley, and they came on to Lae from overland where we had come in from sea, and the 7th Div beat us into Lae by about 15 minutes. They radioed to our command to stop shooting at them. And from there, we were then sent, and we landed again at Finschhafen. And Finschhafen was opposed, quite strongly opposed, and we fought our way up to Finschhafen and also up to a place called the Saddleberg, which the Japanese who had got away from Lae were coming up across the Ramu Valley and up onto Saddleberg, which was a natural place of a pathway. That's why it was called Saddleberg, like it was a saddle mountain set up. And they were, where we were told when we were landing at Finschhafen, there could be anything from 2,000 to 2,000 Japs in the area. in actual fact, there were far more than that. And at Saddleburg, there was a couple of VCs, one there. And going into Finschhafen, our infantry companies were scaling the cliffs up into Finschhafen by hanging on to vines, and the Japanese were on top, attacking them from the top, but they eventually got up there and took the area in Finschhafen. Well, we were spent quite some time there, sort of settling the area, and then we pursued the Japanese from Finschhafen along the north coast of New Guinea up to a place called Sio. One of the amazing things about it that I was the lead platoon for the 9th Division, and we came across a Salvation Army fellow with a New Guinea native who had a copper boiling and were making coffee for the troops that's going past, and we were the first troops going past. How the hell they didn't get taken by the Japanese, God knows, because they're up there ahead of us. And of course this continued all the way along the north coast to Sio, where we were withdrawn. I was taken out of there a bit before the end of it with malaria, and taken down to Moresby, Port Moresby, where I was in hospital until I got over the malaria, and then I went to a con camp at a place called Koitaki. And from there I came back to Australia. We would then went into more training at a place called Ravenshoe, because we were going to be used again. And while we were there, I was enlisted out as B2, and I did not go to Borneo with my unit, and that was the only show that I missed. I was transferred to a G branch of the LFC in Cairns, and I made application to the Deputy Director of Medical Services for a reboard because my unit was going to Borneo and I wished to go with them, and he told me that I'd had my war, and he refused my request for a reboard.
How long were you overseas in total during the war?
Over 2 years in the Middle East, and probably, I'm not sure, I suppose it was 12 months or so up in New Guinea.
How old were you when you first got into combat?
Well, I joined up at 18, and our first combat I turned 19. And so I was a full-blown soldier at 19, but I was a corporal, and my battalion headquarters and headquarter company were taken prisoner in Libya, and we made our way back. The infantry companies made their way back through the coast road, where the junction was that the headquarters had been diverted into the desert. Was a German soldier in the uniform of a British military policeman, and when the infantry companies came along and wanted to know why they were being diverted into the desert instead of going through the coast road, through Derna and to Tobruk, one of the officers noticed that there was a bullet hole in this German soldier or these military policeman's jersey that had blood round it. So he questioned him and realised he was a German, and he shot him. And no more troops were diverted into the desert. We made our way round to the coast road through Derna and then into Tobruk.
Were you ever wounded in combat, Mr. Wallace?
Not in a wound that I went to the RAP or anything, no. I was lucky. I was wounded I had shrapnel on the back of my head and shrapnel in my legs, but I never went to the RAP or to medical services for treatment.
And what was the highest rank by the time you left the service?
I was a sergeant. I was promoted at Alamein, and I took over the anti-tank. Well, I was platoon sergeant of the anti-tank platoon, and in actual fact, I became platoon commander of the anti-tank platoon because my company commander and platoon commander had been blown up on a jeep, and when I went forward, they were doing a reconnaissance, and when I went forward looking for them, I came across the CO, and he asked who I was, and I told him, and he said, Captain Jenkinson, and I've forgotten the name of the platoon commander, had been blown up to go forward and make a recce and get the guns into position. And that was, we entered into the Alamein show at that time. And from there, of course, the attacks took place, and right through the show until the end, we were withdrawn from the line at one stage to practice what we were going to do at a show called Balimba, which was an attack on around about point 23. And I think the idea was that Montgomery wanted to know how strong the Germans were in that particular area, because apparently this was the area he was hoping to make a breakthrough at. Well, the Balimba show, we lost 50-odd men killed and about 120 wounded in a period of about 3.5 hours. And a number of men, of course, that were wounded died after that, so that I think we ended up with 58 actually killed at Balimba. Well, from Balimba, of course, we then were committed to other actions throughout the campaign, and eventually the Germans withdrew on the 4th of November.
Before we go further into your combat experiences, I would like to backtrack a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that you were born in Cairns.
Mm-hmm.
Did you grow up in Cairns?
Yes, to a certain extent. I grew up in Cairns, but then we moved to Gordonvale. My father was looking for employment because those were the Depression days, and we moved to Gordonvale, and I started school in Gordonvale. I went to school there for a number of years, and then my father moved to the Tablelands, the Atherton Tablelands, for employment, and I ended up going to a one-teacher school at Pyramon. And when my father decided that the teacher there was a bit of a nut because he had his appendix taken out under local anaesthetic so he could tell us kids about it. So my father said to me, "You're going away from that school. You'll go to another school called Corrine close to the land or on the other tablelands. So it meant I had to ride a horse to about 8 miles further to Korean, which was another one-teacher school.
Talk to me about your growing up years. What kind of things did you do for fun as a child?
Well, we made our own entertainment as children. As I said, I was an only child. But when I started school, of course, I made friends. And we played different games. We fought with the children from the Catholic schools, because I was at a state school, and there was always fights going on between the two. We had the run of the country at Gordonvale, I beg your pardon, and so that we had a very, very free life. We went camping on our own at a place called Peatsbridge, was one place in particular where we would go and camp for weekends or when holidays were on. And our parents expected us to be able to look after ourselves. We swam, we fished, we had a damn good time. And this was life in Gordonvale. Those days, the Depression days, there'd be a couple of thousand men camped in the racecourse at Gordonvale because they had to have somewhere to live or camp in the Depression, because men were walking across Australia looking for work. In one case, a young man who had been discharged from the ship he came from Britain in, he was a radio operator, and he was discharged in Australia, and he was with this group that camped in the racecourse, and he came to our place one day looking for work or anything in where he could get a meal. And he was a very young man. My mother took pity on him, and he used to have a meal at our place each night for quite a long time, and he kept in contact with my mother for quite a long time. Actually, it was a free life. We more or less did as we liked, providing we didn't get into mischief. There was no graffiti or that sort of thing that happened. We understood we couldn't. Well, we didn't do a destruction of things like happens in later years with the young people. We were well and truly controlled by our parents, and we more or less, apart from going to school, we more or less ran wild, if you would say so, because we were able to go and do as we liked, in the bush, into creeks for swimming, fishing, that sort of thing. And so that it was a completely free and happy life.
Could you please tell me, Mr. Wallace, before the war broke out, what were you planning on doing with your life?
Well, I was at high school, and eventually, I think before I was 16, I left after junior to take a job, because those days it was necessary for children to get employment if they could, because things were very, very hard. Living actually was very hard for our parents to try and maintain a living and to keep themselves and their children in clothing and school and such things that people nowadays don't have any impression of what the Depression was like.
Can you talk to me specifically about some of the struggles that your family faced during the Depression years?
Yes, well, my father was a butcher by trade, but there was not always jobs not always employment available, but he had to take employment wherever he could find it. At one stage when I was going to school in Gordonvale, my father was cutting cane, which was quite a very hard job, and he cut cane for quite some time until he got other employment as a butcher, and at one stage he moved to the Atherton Tablelands, to a place called Pyramon, where he was a slaughterman for a butchering firm in Gordonvale.
When you were growing up, Mr. Wallace, were you aware of what was going on in Germany with the rise of Hitler and the Nazi regime? Or were you aware of what the Japanese were doing in China?
No, I was too young, of course, to take much notice of things like that. Life for a child those days was a case of school, homework, chores in your family, such as yarding the poultry up into the fowl house, collecting eggs, painting the roosts of the fowl or the poultry house to keep insects or that off or away from the fowls. Just general chores about the place, running messages for my mother or whatever, and in general, just behaving as a child those days used to behave. Did as they were told, respected their elders. Everyone was Mr. or Mrs. There was no such thing as calling adults by their Christian name. And life went on, and we were quite happy in the fact that we knew how to behave. We were being taught how to behave. You learned how to use cutlery and the likes of that from your parents. And in general, for a child, life was reasonably comfortable. We didn't get toys and things such as we did, the children do nowadays, but for instance, my first two-wheel bike was from a three-wheel bike that I had, and my cousin and I clamped the back, took one wheel off at the back and clamped the back forks close together, and so from a three-wheel bike I ended up with a two-wheel bike. I don't think I got a proper two-wheel bike until I was about 13 or 14.
Mr. Wallace, how did you hear about the declaration of war when Great Britain declared war on Germany?
Well, probably over the radio, I imagine. I don't recall particularly. I knew that war had started in 1939, and of course I knew then that because we were part of the Commonwealth, we came into the war in that way. And my father had served in the First World War as a machine gunner, and he was only 16 when he went to France in the First World War. And he came home, and I think he and my mother were married. They were both 20 years of age, because they were married in 1920, and I was born in November 1921. And they were two young people, and things were tough. They had naturally a returned soldier from the First World War. They had nothing, and it was a battle right from the start.
Take me through how you... can you tell me about how you ended up joining the militia, and then how you joined the military proper?
Well, I was a Boy Scout, and from there I joined the cadets in the 51st Battalion in Cairns, and then I got a job in the railway as a lad porter at a place called Alamein, south of Cairns, near Tully. And from there, I was still a cadet in the 51st Battalion, and they had a company in Tully. Excuse me. They had a company in Tully, so I used to go down one night a week to Tully and train with the militia troops. I was still a cadet because I could not become a militiaman until I was 18. And I learned about the Vickers machine gun, and I did a couple of camps with the 51st Battalion, and I joined up from, we were in camp at WWII near Bowen in Queensland, and I joined up from there. That's where I joined up to the AIF. I was 18 years of age, and I put my age up 3 years because when war first started, I went to enlist, and the recruiting officer knew me, and he said, "Go home, young Wallace, you're not 18. So that when I joined up from WWII, I put my age up 3 years, and as far as the army is concerned, I'm 100 now.
Why did you want to join the AIF? What was it about it?
Well, it was our Commonwealth was at war with Germany. It was the greatest show in town, and there's a case of joining up and getting there before it was over. And typical young person with no thought of the actual horrors of combat and men getting killed and that, it never occurred to you that it would happen to you. And so that you, as I say, it was the greatest show at the moment, and you had to be part of it.
And so after you joined the AIF, what happens to you?
Well, I went into camp at Red Bank outside Brisbane, where we trained. And because I joined with 3 other fellows, and the 4 of us wanted to go to 4 different units, we all ended up in the 2nd 15th Battalion in the infantry. I had ideas of going into a machine gun battalion because my father had been in a machine gun battalion in the First World War, but I ended up as an infantryman with the 2nd 15th, which I've never regretted. I made some wonderful friends, and that last you all your life. The only trouble, they keep passing away, and you lose your friends until you get to the stage where, at my age now, recently I was trying to think of the name of an officer in my battalion, And I said to my wife, I'll give somebody a ring. And she said to me, who are you going to ring? Because there was no one that I knew alive from my battalion that I could have asked.
What's that like?
Well, I went back to Alamein twice, once in 2002 on the 60th anniversary of the battle at Alamein. There was 9 men and 1 woman that went back at that time, and we visited the war cemetery at Alamein, and we were in Cairo and Alexandria, and saw various things in Alexandria. At that time, apparently the greatest library in the world was being established at Alexandria, and we attended the services at the war cemetery. The 9th Division memorial was at that cemetery, and a colonel, well, he was a major general then, but he was a colonel of the 17th Battalion, and he was very irate because he thought that the memorial should be 25 miles further to the east, to where the actual battles had taken place. And the German and Italian governments had established memorials closer to the actual fighting area than was put up by our lot.
Can you tell me, sir, after you joined the AIF, how do you all get from Australia to the Middle East?
Oh, well, from Brisbane or Red Bank, we were sent to Darwin as garrison troops for several months on a ship called the Zealandia. And when we got to Darwin, we were welcomed by Air Force and Naval troops who were being stood over by the Darwin Mobile Force, a specialist force that had been formed, and so that they were looking that the AIF would be reinforcements for them, which did happen. We fought with the Darwin Mobile Force quite a bit, but we learned quite a bit of trench digging and setting up barbed wire and the likes of that in Darwin, and we became a battalion as a group, which the CO was quite proud of the fact that the way we had really became a decent battalion. From Darwin, then we returned to Red Bank, and from Red Bank then we had a certain amount of training, then 3 weeks pre-embarkation leave, and from there we were transported to Sydney by rail, and we were then embarked on the Queen Mary. There was a convoy being put together in Sydney Harbour, and we went on to the Queen Mary for transport to the Middle East.
And talk to me about that journey.
Well, of course, that journey was, as far as we were concerned, was something really pleasant. Apart from the meals weren't the world's best, but we were in cabins. We were on anti-submarine and fire picket duty on the top decks, and so that it was interesting. At night, while we were up there, we were waiting to see the last of the Southern Cross, which we did. I did with a friend called Jack Kelly. We waited till we saw the last of the Southern Cross. From there we went to Ceylon and Colombo and transferred from the Mary then to a Dutch ship called the Ingenuity, which was a great, what shall I say, let down socially and physically, and because it was quite a very, very old ship, not very well equipped. But however, they had the toilets that were set up for the Asian type of using toilets, and so that we had a great deal of fun of using the taps that were set up in those toilets for anyone outside, where we used to spray anybody going past, and we ended up with the decks of the Ingenuity inches deep in water. But in actual fact, it was a enjoyable trip. We had no worry about there were destroyers and that escorting the convoy, and therefore we did not get any submarines, and we eventually came into the Red Sea and into the Suez Canal, and we were disembarked there, and then into railway carriages to Palestine, where we went into camp and settled down there for a certain amount of training. And we were a few months in Palestine, and then we were transported up to the desert, the Libyan desert, after the 6th Div had cleaned up the Italian army there, and we went to a place called Mersa Briga, very close to the eastern border of Libya, which was a small port, an oil-bearing area, but not in any great amount. And we were there on training because there was supposed to be no threat, no enemy. And as I said earlier, we were not battle-equipped. We had rifle and bayonet, no grenades, 1 Bren gun to a platoon instead of 3, no artillery, very little transport, until one of our fellows was killed by a mine. They were on patrol, and he stepped on a mine in an unmarked field, which was obviously left behind by the Italians or the 6th Div when they were fighting. And another fellow and I, a fellow named Passmore, and I were given the job of burying this young man who was our first casualty. And with the RAP sergeant and the padre, we took him to a place at the 500 kilo peg between Benghazi and Tripoli, and he was buried 21 paces to the left of the road because he was 21 years of age. Later I learned that he was only 18 also, as he had put his age up 3 years. And His name was Kelvin Croker, and he was our first casualty. Now, while we were burying him, we were fired on by a fighter plane, and we hit the dirt, of course. And when the plane went away, we continued to dig the grave for him, and the fighter plane came back and gave us another burst. And after it had gone, we carried on, and eventually we buried Kelvin, and the fighter plane came back again the third time to give us a go, and we joined Kelvin in the hole with him. Eventually the plane must have realised what we were doing, and he went away. So we buried Kelvin, and on the way back to our unit, I suddenly realised that the plane was a 109, a Messerschmitt 109, and I thought, what the hell is a German fighter doing here? Because no one had a clue that there were any Germans closer than Berlin. So we went back to our position, and the next day a great bomber came over, and I realised it had a big black cross on it, and I ran for the one Bren gun that we had set up for anti-aircraft in a pit, and this bomber came over very low, and the gun had been covered with an old shirt and fastened with a safety pin to keep the dust and dirt out of it. And when this bomber was coming, I was trying to get the shirt off the gun, and I couldn't get the safety pin undone. And as the plane went over the top of us, probably about 50 feet up, the rear gunner realised that I was at the Bren, and he let drive with his guns. And luckily for me, his guns would have been set for air warfare, probably at 100 yards, 120 yards or so, and the bullets in both guns went either side of the pit I was in. So that I had been fired on twice in 2 days. And from there, all of a sudden the Africa Corps appeared, and it was a case of the all Allied troops made a hell of a leather dash for Egypt, except for the Australians, and our General Morshead had said the Australians go for Tobruk, there will be no retreat and no surrender. So bit by bit we made our way back to Tobruk because transport was very scarce, and at one stage I was on top of the Bachi Pass with my section, and I had gone along and said to my fellows to build up a breastwork of stones because we had no sandbags or anything like that. And I came across to an old roo shooter who we used to call the Russian Private because of his name, and he said he wasn't going to build up a breastwork of stones. I said, why not? He said, anything that goes through and misses me goes through. He said, I'm not going to be wounded by stone chips. Well, I thought he was an old roo shooter. He knew what 303s could do. And I thought, well, I can take a good advice too, so I didn't build up any stonework either. But around about 2 o'clock in the morning, we were withdrawn with whatever transport there was and moved back a few miles back, and then we went to ground again until further transport was available to take us further back. And this happened all the way to Tobruk. We were withdrawn when we would partly dig in, and that night there would be a bit of transport available. We would be taken back a bit further. So by dribs and drabs, we made our way back to Tobruk.
Before we go any further, sir, I just wanted to question you about some of the stories that you had just told. You had talked about being strafed while burying the body of Kroger.
Yes.
Talk to me about that. What was it like to have an enemy plane firing bullets at you?
Well, the thing was that at the time I knew we were being fired on by a fighter, but it didn't register that what fighter it was. I wondered what the hell we were being fired on by a fighter plane. But then, after we had buried Kelvin and were making our way back to our unit, I suddenly realised that it was an ME-109. And I wondered what the hell a German fighter plane was doing here, because we had no idea there were any Germans closer than Berlin. And so that my aircraft recognition must have worked all right. My aircraft recognition training, anyhow.
And then the next day, the incident with the German bomber.
Yeah.
What was the destruction that the German bomber caused?
Oh, he didn't cause any, didn't drop any bombs. But the rear gunner had a go at me because he could see me at the Bren gun. And but luckily he didn't hit, so it's...
Were you ever able to get the shirt undone?
Oh, yes, eventually.
No, but I'm saying, were you able to fire the Bren gun while the plane was...
No, I was not able to. I would have loved to have been, so well.
That would have been quite an experience. 2 days in combat and you've already shot down a plane.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it would have been if I'd been like some of the fighter blokes in the First World War that used to cut the Iron Cross out of the German planes that they'd shot down.
So, can you talk to me then? What happens after that? Those first 2 days?
Oh, anyhow, as I said, we had very little transport, so we were transported back several miles to try and keep us ahead of the Germans, and then we'd partly dig in there, and that night we'd get a bit more transport, and we'd get transported back a bit further. And as I said, we came across this Provo on the turn-off to the desert. Well, we were the infantry companies, and we wanted to know why we were being diverted into the desert. And then when this officer realised that there was a bullet hole in this bloke's jersey with blood around it, he questioned him and found out he was a German, so he shot him. And no more troops were diverted into the desert.
Did you hear about this or you saw this?
I didn't see it, but I heard about it.
Okay. What was that like when you had heard that there were Germans now dressing up as Allied forces? I mean, doesn't that make you doubt everyone you see and everything you're told?
Well, of course, we realised straight away that they were so better trained actually than we were, that they had been in action, and we were, raw troops and green as grass, and so that we had to realise that we were up against an army that had, a panzer force that had come across Europe, and nothing had stopped them. And at that time we didn't know the fact of Rommel, who had come up with a completely different use of tanks to anyone had done before. and he came undefeated across Europe, and then he was the leader of this Africa Corps Panzer Force in Libya that was after us. So we were just managing to keep, what should you say, a half head ahead of them on our way to Tobruk. Well, we came into Tobruk at the Alamein roadblock, and of course we didn't know anything about Tobruk. We'd never been there before, and I had my section digging in, and like a young corporal, thinking that doing things by the book, I was making a range card, and which so that I could give fire orders off my range card later on. Well, then we realised that where we were digging in, there was a tank force with these people, and we had to move further into to the Tobruk perimeter itself. And because our headquarters had been taken prisoner, we were the reserve battalion. The 2nd, 13th and 2nd, 17th were the frontline battalions, and they were told by Mooreshead, our general, to let the tanks go past and clean up the infantry behind them, which they did particularly well. And the tanks came in, and I was dug in to the east of the Royal Horse Artillery, a British artillery regiment, and they were magnificent, the RHA, and they were the actual deciding factor in us beating the Germans at the Easter Battle. They were firing at 50 yards at the tanks. Our fellows who had never fired other than a 303 or a Brig gun were using equipment that was left behind by the Italians when the 6th Div cleaned them up, and finding out how to use them as anti-tank guns and that sort of thing. And the tanks suddenly realised they had no infantry support, and they panicked. And they'd come in there completely confident that we would run away from the tanks. And they found out that they had come across troops that weren't running away from the tanks, that they were fighting them. And they lost quite a number of tanks in that attack, and they panicked and started to withdraw. Well, then I don't know the exact number of tanks that were knocked out, but quite a few. And the 17th and 13th had cleaned up their infantry, but a group of Germans had got into an old tank trap, and they were commanded by a Colonel Ponath, one of Rommel's top soldiers, and he had intended for them to stay in this tank trap and not be discovered and wait there till nightfall so they could attack the artillery. Well, they were discovered. Someone spotted them, and there was a Bren gun carrier sent to either end of this old tank trap and fired on them. Well, this Ponath came out of this tank trap, more or less indicating he was going to surrender. And the regimental sergeant major went to him, and he refused to surrender to an NCO. So the RSM sent for an officer. This officer came out with a young fellow with a Thompson to protect him, and the officer had a revolver. And this Ponath I beg your pardon, this Ponath realised that they weren't going to be able to carry out their plan, and he was going to surrender, but then when this officer got out there, he organised his own suicide. He pulled his revolver out and fired a couple of shots out of it into the air, and the officer, the 15th Battalion officer, shot him dead. Well, when he shot him dead, the troops he had been commanding were in a hell of a state. They rushed to wrap him in a swastika flag, which is now in the Canberra War Memorial. And they were taken prisoner, of course. And Ponath was the man who had captured our battalion headquarters in the desert. So that it was rather poetic justice that a 2nd 15th Battalion officer should be the one that shot him dead. And that was the end of the Easter battle, in which we had defeated the Germans for the first time on land in World War II.
The incident with Ponath, were you able to see this happen, or you had heard about this later from the
No, I heard about it because the area where he surrendered or intended to surrender and organised his own suicide, because as that went on, he would have been then recorded as being killed in action and not as surrendering, when in actual fact he did surrender.
So he was so concerned about how it would look if he had surrendered that he wanted to get himself killed.
Because he would be typical German officer, that he couldn't have been shown as surrendering.
Sounds like a Japanese.
Yeah, that they're a militaristic country, and the German officer group, you understand they are fanatics in that particular thing. Where Britain is not a militaristic country any more than we are. We're a free-living country in that, but the Germans have always been military-minded, and over the years, and the German officer corps were, of course, fanatics about being shown as actual fighting soldiers and not surrendering. Well, as I was talking about the siege of Tobruk, which actually started with that Easter battle between the 20th Brigade, the 20th Australian Brigade, and the German forces of General Rommel, and they were defeated for the first time on land in World War II by we, who were as green as grass troops, had never been in action before, but were determined, because our general had said there will be no retreat and no surrender, we were determined there was no way on God's earth we were going to retreat. In any case, we would have had to swim the Mediterranean to retreat. But the fact that we weren't going to let our forebears down by being beaten by the Germans, and we were actually determined that there was no way in the world we were going to be beaten. And of course, when we had defeated them, we were pretty proud of ourselves to think that we had done the job that we were intended to do. The Tobruk was an Italian township because they had colonised Libya, and then they had a defensive perimeter that probably was about 40 miles round and about 12 miles, I suppose, from the actual town of Tobruk. and they had concrete posts at different distances apart, so that eventually when we had defeated them, then we started to get into these Italian posts ourselves. But because of the distance between them, we also had intermediate posts which were dug in to the ground, and a certain amount of troops were in these intermediate posts, so that the Germans didn't get into Tobruk on that particular occasion. And the only other occasion when they broke the line was when the salient was formed. That's when they attacked the 2nd 24th Battalion with flame-throwing tanks, and they cleaned out one post, and they took one post. It was next door to the post that I was in, and they established a salient. They broke through our line and established a salient, which they mined heavily, mined and barbed wired. The Germans mined this salient, and that was the closest they ever got to Tobruk. It was an area at a place called Hill 209, which was probably the highest point around Tobruk. So they had a fair view of the place, but they just couldn't get any further. And we were supposed to hold the place for 2 months. Well, we eventually held it for 8 months before we were relieved. And in actual fact, we controlled no man's land. That we patrolled no man's land every night. And the Germans had a habit of using fixed lines. But that is when a weapon is trained on a certain area, and they would fire, say, every 20 minutes, or they might be fired 20 minutes, then a few seconds later. Well, we learned to navigate our way across no man's land by moving to where they fired and wait until they fired and then move across. And that's how we navigated our way across no man's land to their lines, where we lifted mines and attempted to take prisoners, and that, so we knew who we were up against. And there were odd actions taking place from time to time. On the way back, I was sent on an advance party with the Lieutenant Bill Cobb, and our driver was Don Keyes, and we were driving without headlights, and we were coming across this area when Bill said to Don, "When I tell you, turn round and go for your life." He said, "There's a bloody tank up there and we don't have any tanks." Well, we were half turned round when there was bayonets into the side of the truck and foreign language, and I thought, Jesus Christ, we've been taken prisoner. And we were prisoners for about 20 minutes until a British colonel came along, and typical British, "By Jove, what have we here?" And in actual fact, we had been taken prisoner by the 18th Indian Brigade. And so that after 20 minutes we went on our way, but we had been prisoners for 20 minutes or so. And the Indians had taken us prisoners. And of course, with the Indian language and that, I didn't know whether it was Indian or German or what it was. All I knew was we'd been taken prisoner, and one of the few things I wanted not to happen.
Are the Indians known for fighting well in North Africa?
Yes, the Indians did well. The 18th Infantry Brigade were quite a good unit.
Can you please, when you were on this scout party that you just mentioned, where were you going?
We were making our way to Tobruk. Well, we had to find out how it could be used as a fighting position. We had no knowledge of the fact that there was concrete emplacements or anything like that there, and we were sort of be able to lead our infantry regiments or companies into positions. Well, of course, we didn't get time to do anything much like that about that because the Germans were so close behind us. It was a case of get in and get dug in if we could and wait for the German to attack, which they did very quickly. And a matter of 3 days after we had hit Tobruk, the Germans were there attacking us.
After the Indians let you go, did you did you finish your mission to go to Tobruk, or you went back to your lines?
No, we carried forward as far as we could, but then our infantry company started to catch up, and we went into Tobruk probably a few hours ahead of the infantry companies, but that's about all.
Can you please describe the original fortifications that you found at Tobruk, and during your occupation of Tobruk, how did you change those fortifications or make them better?
When we got into Tobruk, of course, we found out, of course, the Italians had concrete emplacements at various distances apart for the whole perimeter, which was probably about 40 miles of perimeter. And being the fact that there was 14,000 Australians, we couldn't occupy all the things. And so the Australians weren't the only rats at Tobruk. The Indians, there were some Jewish troops there at one stage, and eventually 2 other brigades were brought into to Tobruk to eventually establish a division, which we weren't in the first place, and also the 18th Brigade of the 9th, 10th and 12th Battalions were there for a period as well. And so that we got to use the emplacements, but because of the distances they were apart, we had to dig in other places between them to make sure that the line was complete. The emplacements were well made. They were one open area which I obviously realised had to be an anti-tank gun emplacement. We used to call it the tennis court. But generally, they were covered over at top, and you had certain areas which were fire positions. And, of course, we learned to use them. And, of course, then our minefield in front of my particular post at that stage were old Italian aerial bombs with the nose pointing up out of the ground. I doubt if they'd have gone off, we'd have hit them with a hammer, but that is what we had, and then barbed wire emplacements in front of that. And so that there were tank traps, of course, around these positions, and so that really and truly it was, for us anyhow, it was quite an impressive emplacement. We had nothing, and we had nothing in the way of equipment, and so eventually we got more equipment and more Bren guns and grenades. We had mortar platoons and that sort of thing, and also then we had artillery, the Royal Horse Artillery, and then Australian regiments, artillery regiments came in as well, so that we were reasonably well established. We weren't as strong or as well equipped as the Germans. Their equipment was magnificent. Even their rifles were something that you could have used as a hunting rifle. And the Germans always spoke about how good our snipers were. Well, we didn't have any snipers. They were just the ordinary fellows that would see movement or that and would have a shot at it. And we had one faculty that we used where you were looking or observing the Germans. We would have Hessian hanging down. When we were observing them, we were looking through Hessian, but we were looking through small holes in it, where the Germans, they were looking out, we could see the reflection of light from their faces. So we used to fire into those reflections. And this is where they presumed we had snipers. Well, anybody that saw them had a go. And apparently they must have been reasonably good shots. So that overall we had command of no man's land. And as I said earlier, we navigated our way across from where the Germans had fixed lines we'd go to where the fixed line was, where they were firing, wait until it stopped and move across. Happy Valley was a small area of seawater. Tobruk was a harbour, and this was a beach area a little apart from the harbour, where you could go down and swim, and the Stukas that were bombing the harbour would strafe this area when they saw troops there. They also strafed the troops in the front line, on their way back to their base.
Did you ever go to Happy Valley?
Only twice in the time I was there, and had a bath in the salt water in the sea and that, and thoroughly enjoyed it. And luckily we weren't strafed at the time I was there. But earlier we were talking about Tobruk and the significance of Tobruk.
Yes, sir.
Tobruk was the only port between Benghazi and Tripoli of any consequence, and so that as a supply line for our troops and an escape line for our prisoners, our wounded and prisoners of war and that, we were serviced by what they call the scrap iron flotilla. There were a number of Australian destroyers that came and serviced Tobruk in the matter of bringing in reinforcements, bringing in supplies, and in general keeping us supplied and keeping us there, because without the Navy we'd have got no supplies at all. And they did a magnificent job. And of course the 300-mile run from Tobruk to Alexandria was Stuka Valley, because the Stukas used to attempt to pick up the destroyers on their way back to Alexandria. Only once in the period there that the Germans put on a 1,000 bomber air raid of bombers of different types, and they plastered the area as best they could, but it didn't do the damage I think that they anticipated that it would. It was just another factor of something extra that the fellows in the harbour area had to put up with, more so than we in the front line, because they used to bomb the harbour and they used to strafe the front line when they were going back to their bases.
What do you remember about that air raid? What was it like to see 1,000 German planes above you?
Well, I don't think we in the front line sort of regarded it with any, what shall I say, great significance. We didn't know what damage it would do to the harbour, but as far as we were concerned, it was just another part of putting up with what we'd been copping every day between Stukas and artillery. We were under fire pretty solidly the whole time. Now, of course, in Tobruk it was no holiday camp. The heat by day was terrific. But being Australians and coming from a hot country, we more or less handled it pretty well. And the fact that water was scarce was probably one of the main troubles, and the water was not particularly potable because a lot of it was desalinated, and of course we just had to put up with that. That the water was quite brackish. Made a very, very strong cup of tea, of course, being so brackish. But in general, our refrigerator was about a quarter of an acre square and about 4 or 5 cases of bully beef high out in the open sun and whatever other weather conditions, such as the dust storms that we had, the camp scene could blow up from any time at all, where you couldn't see a yard in front of your face. And if you happened to be out on patrol at night and a dust storm blew up, it was difficult to find your way back to your lines. The only thing you had to guide you was the fact that as long as we went north, we were going the right way. When there was no dust storms, you could read your compass or your watch by the light of the stars at night. And with my particular company, B Company, we had a fellow called Ted Donkin who played the saxophone and used to play every night. And one of the main tunes he used to play was Estrelita, Little Star. And the B Company blokes, if you were out on patrol and there was a dust storm up, if Donkin was playing his sax, you knew the way home. You head for the sax.
But wouldn't that attract German artillery fire?
Which?
His saxophone, or the bugle, him playing the instrument, wouldn't that attract the German artillery fire as well?
Not really. What I mean, he wasn't playing that loud that probably the Germans could hear it, but, there's only one man in a company headquarters in a 40-mile perimeter.
Fair enough.
So that it would be hard to establish where he was. But we knew where he was.
Can you talk about just the worst part about the dust storms? I mean, when the sandstorms, what happens to your body when you're getting pelted with sand?
Well, you're not actually being pelted with sand. A dust storm that just seeps into everything, depending on how hard it was blowing, of course. But everything got covered in dust. Your weapons, you had to make sure that they were covered. Even we'd have a cap over the top of our rifle barrels. Your weapons, your machine guns and that, you would put what cover you could over them. And it was just something you had to put up with. You had no option. It never rained, and so that there was nothing you could do about it. Water was so scarce. You got one water bottle a day, and that had to do you for all day, for drinking, washing, cleaning your teeth, or making a cup of tea or whatever at the time. And of course, the reserve water in your platoon area would be a 44-gallon drum. Well, when you went to take over a new platoon area, you always tested the water in that 44-gallon drum to make sure it was drinkable, and not that somebody had used it all and had it refilled by somebody going down to Happy Valley or that and filling it with salt water. So these are the things you had to be careful of, even with your own trips, you know. You couldn't take for granted that it would be a potable water that was in that 44-gallon drum.
Do you believe that because of the dust storms or the sandstorms, did that cause your weapons to jam? Even with the caps on the barrels, do you feel like in combat some of the men's weapons jammed because of the sand?
Not really. You know, it was one of the things that you cleaned your weapons every day, and particularly your automatic weapons. And we were pretty adept at keeping our weapons in good shape. We even used any weapons we captured or that. You learned how to fire them and use them as well, because any extra weapons were always handy. Well, during the Easter battle, when the Germans attacked us with tanks and infantry, the tanks got through too close to the artillery. The Royal Horse Artillery, which I had said earlier, were so magnificent in their efforts. One instance was when they were firing at point-blank range at the tanks, and the battery sergeant major for Chestnut Troop had his arm almost shot off at the shoulder and was still giving fire orders, which showed the quality of the RHA troops. They were called the RHA Royal Horse Artillery because some of the troops were called, or all of the troops were called, Chestnut or Roan or whatever it happened to be, the name of or the colour of the horse. And they did a magnificent job. It is hard to describe how, should I say, dramatic it was to be dug in as infantry and this artillery firing over your head into the tanks, and seeing the tanks being blasted and stopped well and truly, and then being so confident that they'd never been beaten before, panicking then and starting to retreat. And that was when we knew we had them beaten. The Germans started to retreat, the German tanks. They panicked. They had lost their infantry support, and as any infantryman knows, tanks might take an area, but they can't hold it, where infantry must be boots on the ground to hold the area.
What was the distance between the artillery and the German tanks, and where were you positioned during that battle?
Well, I was to the east of of Chestnut Troop, and probably a little forward of the artillery, and they were firing at point-blank ranges, so 50 yards at the tanks, and they certainly were stopping them. They weren't using armour-piercing. I don't know if the artillery had armour-piercing stuff for their particular guns, but they were certainly stopping the tanks with the explosive shells. And the tanks, as I said earlier, panicked and started to withdraw.
What did it look like when the German tanks were hit?
Well, you could see this massive explosion on the tank, and not being able to see inside, but you can imagine the concussion effect inside that tank, because they weren't that large that there would be room for the concussion to dissipate. Some of the tanks were on fire, and the crews trying to get out with machine guns as they tried to get out, and that eventually the tanks that could were retreating and withdrawing.
Were there any German infantry soldiers left after their tanks withdrew?
Oh, there were some, and as I mentioned earlier about the group that were in the old tank trap, were hoping to stay there undiscovered until night so they could attack the artillery, but they were discovered. And as I spoke earlier of that Colonel Ponath, who arranged his own suicide so that he would be remembered as being killed in action, not surrendering.
But now, because of your testimony, that's never going to happen.
No.
Which is good, because he killed himself.
Oh, of course he did.
Yeah. Mr. Wallace, could you please tell me about the first time you interacted with German prisoners of war? Do you remember how you got those prisoners of war, and what did you do once you got them?
Well, in Tobruk, the only prisoner of war that I had close contact with was a young pilot who had bailed out because there was an air battle going on at the same time as the Easter battle, and we were moving up to do a counterattack on a position, and we picked up this pilot as we moved up, and when we told him he was a prisoner, he laughed at us and said, "You'll be my prisoners in 2 or 3 days." So they were that confident that they were going to overcome us in Tobruk. The Germans, yes, they were so confident. And probably that was one of the things that assisted us, because we were so determined we weren't going to be beaten. Well, we're in this position where we were sent to do the counterattack and where we picked up this German pilot. We moved up to this position, but when we got there, the Germans were withdrawing, and there was a German truck there with the flap down at the back, and someone walked over to have a look in there, and they came back and someone said, "What's in the truck?" They said, "Nothing." So someone else walked over, curious, to have a look, and I did the same thing, and when I lifted the flap, there was the fist of a dead German right in my face, and the truck was full of dead Germans, and that everyone that went over there when they came back didn't tell anyone else what was in there. They just said nothing and let the other fellows go and find out for themselves, because it was rather startling to lift up this flap and find a dead German's fist in your face. There were at least 15 or 20 dead Germans in that truck. They had been freshly killed. It's not as if they were there for any time, because the action was taking place all the time. And as we were moving up to them, they had withdrawn from these trenches, or were withdrawing, and we were moving through their trenches, checking out dugouts or anything like that for further Germans. One particular funny thing about this particular situation was that we had been told about cakes of soap and fountain pens and thermos flasks being dropped as booby traps, so that my friend one of my friends, Roy Parker, and I were going through these trenches, and we come across a good-looking black fountain pen, and we looked at one another and decided whether to pick it up or not take the risk of it being a booby trap. So we got a rock and dropped it on top of this fountain pen, and there was no explosion. And shortly afterwards, one of our fellows came through and asked if anyone had seen a black fountain pen. It was one his mother had sent to him, and he'd lost it. Well, we didn't tell him at the time because there would have been 2 more casualties there, because we had dropped the rock on the fountain pen that his mother had sent to him. I told him about this years later, after the war, when I reckon by that time he would have had a sense of humour restored.
How did he react when you told him?
Well, he laughed at that time too, but had I told him at the time it happened, would have been a different story altogether.
When you guys did you encounter any Germans who were firing back when you were going through their areas?
Not generally, no. They were retreating and we were moving up after them. They were retreating and the firing was going on from our side. They just wanted to get out of it.
Can you talk to me about what other kind of booby traps the Germans would use, and any that you came across in your experiences?
Yes, there was an occasion when, as I had mentioned earlier about the salient, we had been moving up into a position where we were to dig a trench, quite a solid trench, and roof it with old corrugated iron and spread dirt and turf or whatever on the iron to camouflage it. And we were to spend the day in that trench, and that night we were to attack up the salient. Well, the salient was alive with bombs and booby traps set by the Germans, and it would have been absolutely massacre for us had we attacked up there. And luckily that evening the officers in command realised this would have been a waste of men, and the attack was called off. On our moving up to that position, I come across a young fellow, a young signaller, and he was mortally wounded, and I bent down to see if I could do anything for him, and he said, "Don't touch the phone, sir, don't touch the phone." And he thought it was booby-trapped. And in actual fact, he had already set that booby trap off, which had wounded him. But that's all I could think to say, "Don't touch the phone, don't touch the phone." Well, he was badly wounded by a booby trap, which would have been a booby trap, a jumping jack, which had 3 small prongs on the top of it, and if you stepped on it or disturbed it, the initial explosion would blow the jumping jack bomb up to about chest height, and then it would explode. And normally they had about 1,200 ball bearings in them, so when they exploded, there were 1,200 ball bearings spread at the force of the explosion to wound other people around the area.
And so this signaller had stepped on a jumping jack?
Yes, he had obviously stepped on a jumping jack, and it hadn't killed him, but he had in his mind, he was mortally wounded, and in his mind he thought he had put the phone on it. And when I approached him to see if I could do anything for him, all he could say was, "Don't touch the phone, sir, don't touch the phone."
So even as he was dying,
He was dying at that time, yes.
but even even though he was mortally wounded, he was more concerned about the welfare of others.
Yes, that was the thing that happened quite often of fellows in that position, that they were thinking about the damage that could be done to others who came along.
How old would you say this man was?
Well, I would suppose he would be no older than 19 or 20.
Can you tell me, when you're in combat, does age matter? Most of the men in combat are in their teens and 20s. Can you explain? I mean, is there a big difference when you're dealing with...
In combat, the troops were not all teenagers or that, although a great percentage of them were. But you had men from the First World War there. You had men of getting toward middle age that were experienced in life and such. So that there was a cross-patch of ages, and generally speaking, the older fellows had experience in life that could guide us younger ones when we had questions about what we should do in certain circumstances. That was very, very helpful for the younger troops. One instance in Alamein, when a truck approached my position where I had one of the anti-tank guns placed, and I was the only one at that time, was just on dusk, that was awake. And I saw this truck coming, and at first I thought it might have been our Russian truck had got lost. But then I realised it wasn't, it was a German truck, and I thought it was probably lorried infantry. So it pulled up, and two men got out of the front and started to walk towards my position, although they couldn't see me. It was dusk, and they one said something in German, and I realised they were German, so I shot them both. I killed one, and the other I wounded, and he went to ground, and he was crying for his mother and his for mercy sort of thing. He was obviously badly wounded. So I went forward to check out who he was or what they were, and I realised it wasn't a truckload of lorried infantry, because they were the only two that come out, and no infantry came from the back of the truck. And this fellow, I went through his pockets for the paperwork to find out what unit he was from and who he was. And I had already called out to the section leader of the next section to me that I had thought they were lorried infantry, and they had fired on the back of this truck with the Bren gun, their Bren gun, and no one had come out of the back of the truck. But I was down on the ground going through this fellow's pockets for his papers and things, and he was an officer, a German officer, and during this time this truck started to explode, and it was quite evidently a truckload of artillery ammunition, German artillery ammunition, that they must have been taking to some of the forward artillery, and they had got lost. And this explosion took place over the heads of myself and this German officer, and I was going through his pockets and through his wallet, and I came across this photo of his wife and 2 young daughters, and I hated myself because I had killed their 2 children's father. And I was so desolated for the fact that I had killed their father, and I could do nothing for him to keep him alive. And the truck exploding over my head, so I was pinned down to the ground, and I ended up there for a couple of hours, and I held this German officer's hand while he passed away. And I ended up writing a poem about it years later because he was always on my mind, and the fact that I had the photo of his wife and the 2 children, and I just couldn't get over the fact that I'd killed their father. And I was really just disgusted with myself, but not that I knew he had a wife and daughters when I shot him, but the fact that I had done it and left them without their father.
But you do know that if you didn't kill him, they would have killed someone else from your side.
Oh, quite, I always thought, of course, that the shells that they were carrying would have gone to an artillery piece that would have fired on us and killed any amount of our people, so that in actual fact, military fact, I did the right thing, but I still couldn't help the emotional side of it, that I regretted the fact that I had killed these 2 children's father.
I appreciate you telling me that story, sir. Would you have wanted to talk to them, the children?
Well, I would have liked to have sent the photo back to them, but it's many years, and you misplace things, and of course you don't want to recalling all that time. All the time, it was distressing enough, and when you had to go through it. There was one point that took place in Tobruk, and I mentioned earlier there was an air battle going on above us when the Easter battle was on, and there was one Hurricane pilot shot down, and he was from 3 Squadron. And years later I was talking to some Air Force fellows, and they said 3 Squadron was never in Tobruk. Well, I said, I've got news for you. I said, I've got a photo at home of a grave of an Air Force pilot from a Hurricane called K.K. Jones, and he was from 3 Squadron.
Did you actually see the plane getting hit?
No, I did not, but there was, of course, I was engaged in a land battle, and there was an air battle going on, Italians and Germans and British Hurricanes, and the Hurricanes got the worst of it, I'm afraid, because they were overpowered by the number of enemy planes. Earlier on, or later on I should say, in Tobruk, I was sent to do a reconnaissance of a horseshoe area around the El Adam Road area, where there was an intention of my company, B Company, to attack this area. And Seth Guest, a lieutenant, and myself went out into this position in the middle of this horseshoe area. We were very close to the German lines and we could hear them talking quite plainly. And I heard a mortar go off, and normally when you hear a mortar, if it's a 3-inch, it'll take 17 seconds for the bomb to arrive, and if it's a 4.5, of course, it comes from a further distance and takes longer. And when I heard this hoof of a mortar firing, automatically I kept counting in my mind, and as I got to the 17 second when I expected a mortar explosion, there was a massive explosion right over my head. And Guesty started to laugh, and I said, "What's wrong with you, you silly bastard?" And he said, "There was a clear 3 foot of air between you and the ground then." And we worked out that we must have been lying almost under the muzzle of the cannon that was firing on the harbour. And when I expected a mortar to explode, this gun had fired with this massive explosion. Well, with us both of us laughing, and that the enemy heard us and started up an AFV, that's an armed fighting vehicle, with the intention of coming out to see if they could pick us up. And I said to Guesty, "Come on, we're out of here." And of course we withdraw very, very smartly out of the area.
Could you describe the German minefields that you came across during the Battle of Tobruk? Can you describe the way they laid them out and what kind of mines did they have?
The Germans were very, very systematic with their defensive things, much in that I've earlier said about the fixed lines, that we managed to navigate our way through them. And their minefields were similar, although their anti-tank mines were the Alamein with a brass detonator on top, and it had a sort of a small tablet on top that had a depression through it that you could put a coin into and turn it either to red or white. If it was turned to white, it was safe. If it turned to red, it was armed and would go off. And also that when we started to lift these mines, and they realised we were awake up to the disarming on the top of the mines, they started to attach detonators to the bottom of the mine and a cord to a peg in the ground underneath the mine, so that unless you dug round the mine and scooped out the dirt around it and felt underneath for these detonators or the cords to these detonators, and you could either cut the cord or slip a nail, because these detonators had a small hole between the, the trigger of the mine, and if you could stick a nail in through there to prevent the striker cap from working. The Alameins had these big brass detonator on top. And many years after the war, I brought one of these Alamein detonators home with me, and I never ever queried whether I'd disarmed it or not. It was turned to white, and I don't think I ever tried to detonate it. But years later I gave it to the Deputy Commissioner of DVA here in Queensland to take to Canberra. She was going down there and they wanted any stuff they could put on for a demonstration. So when she got to the airport and had to go through the checkpoint, they took the detonator off it because they could see they didn't know whether it was disarmed or not. So she gave me a good talking to when she came back, that I'd got her into a great deal of trouble.
What happened to the detonator? Did they throw it away?
Oh, they took the detonator from her. I suppose they would have destroyed it.
They should have given it back to you.
Oh, well, they didn't know unless they had fired it. They wouldn't have known whether it was armed or not. Another instance in Tobruk was we were in a position and I had a fellow from the ASC as part of my section. They had lost their transport and one of his corporals had been killed a couple of nights before and the other one wounded. And this fellow was the last one of the ASC that I had with me. And he was lying in a crawl trench, which is a very shallow trench between deeper trenches, and this bit of canvas over the top to keep the sun off him. And he said to me, "Hey, Gordon, I can see stones coming out of the air." I said, "For Christ's sake, don't move," because they were mortar bombs, and because they were pretty well aimed onto our position, he could see them coming down out of the sky. Luckily, they didn't hit any of us, but the possibility was there. And had he moved, he would have been in a position, irrespective of where they exploded, of being wounded or killed.
What was his name?
Says Twinning, oh yes. He was one of the ASC fellows that I had with me. Yes, there were a number of strange things that happened to us. For instance, there were no toilets in Tobruk in these concrete emplacements at all. And of course we had to dig our own in a bit of dead ground. And dead ground is a depression area where you hope you're not being seen by the enemy. Well, one of my fellows, Jimmy Arnold, went out to the toilet, and when he was finished, not thinking, he did the most natural thing in the world, which was to stand up and put his pants up. Well, the Germans saw him and they lobbed a mortar over, and he was badly wounded by that mortar, so that it was a lesson hardly learned to be, remember when you went to the toilet, you squatted down, and you squatted down to pull your pants up as well.
Could you please describe the lack of movement during the siege of Tobruk? It sounds that you guys were hunkered down in one place for a long time. I know that you went on patrols into the German territory, but it seems that you always came back to your positions, and you guys were constantly under German artillery and mortar fire.
Yeah, well, as you realise, of course, that in daylight the desert was flat. There was very, very few high points, and movement by daylight was practically impossible because you were under sunlight, and could be seen quite plainly that most of our action took place at night, so that you didn't move about much during daylight. In the concrete posts, of course, it was all right because parts of it were covered and you could move around in there. But in the intermediate posts, you could not, because you were in slit trenches and you had very little room to move anywhere. If you did move, it would have been on the flat of your belly or natural, or sort of crawling. So that daylight was a no-no. It's a very rare thing that you moved about in daylight.
Do you remember any specific times that you got into a firefight against the Germans during the day at Tobruk?
Not really, no.
Mostly at night?
Mostly at night, yeah.
And can you describe to me the trenches that you were living in during the siege of Tobruk? What did they look like? How did you guys make them more livable since you were there for such a long time?
Well, in the concrete posts, of course, parts of it were covered so that you had areas where you could sit and have a meal or have a sleep, for that matter, in daylight. And you knew you weren't being seen. In the area that we called the tennis court, of course, that was quite bare, and you could be seen there. And then the intermediate posts, of course, they were slit trenches, and there was no room to do much at all. You had a bit of canvas over the top to keep the sun off you, but otherwise there was little room for movement. Earlier I said about watching for the Southern Cross to disappear, and the fellow I was there with was Jack Kelly. Now, Jack was my lance corporal, and then when 9 section were taken prisoner on the run back, Jack got his second stripe and had to reform 9 section. Well, when they were in a different position to the 7 and 8 sections, and they got heavily mortared one afternoon. And that, as I said earlier, you couldn't move about in daylight. And I went back that night to get orders and any mail or anything from company headquarters. And they told me that Jack Kelly had been killed. And I had to go back and tell his brother Tom, or his nickname was Coog, that his brother had been killed. And my friend Roy Parker met me before I got back to my position, and he said, "How did 9 go?" I said, "Jack got killed." He said, "Who's going to tell Coog?" Well, I said, I knew damn well there was only one person who was going to tell Coog. Well, after that, Coog asked to be transferred to another unit, and he eventually transferred to the 2nd, 3rd Anti-Tank Regiment. And I always felt that Coog blamed me for the fact that Jack had been killed, because Jack had got his second stripe and moved to another section. And I could have said no for him going, but I was quite happy to see him get his second stripe. And so that years later, at the 50th anniversary of our battalion association, I was speaking to Jack Foxley, who was the corporal of 9 section, who had been taken prisoner on the run back. And I said to Jack, I always felt that Coog would blame me for Jackie being killed. And he said, you know, Coog and I are very good friends. He said he's never ever blamed you for that. And Coog was across the other side of where this service was taking place, looking straight across at it. And Jack said to me, "Coog's there looking straight across at us now." And when this service was over, Coog walks across to us and was speaking to us. And after the war, he became the managing director of Carlton United in Queensland, but he never ever mentioned anything about blaming me about Jack being killed.
What kind of person was Jack Kelly?
What kind of a person? Jack Kelly was he was in his late 20s, but a real gentleman and a fine man altogether. And I treasured his friendship greatly, and I was very distressed when he was killed. And when we were doing patrols, I never sent the two Kelly boys out together. I said one or the other, because I never wanted to have to write to Mr. Kelly and tell him that both his sons had been killed. So these are the things you've got to think about, compassion and sympathy and stuff like that. So that there's a lot of emotional stuff that happens during wartime. Was another point of trouble and interest, and it was an area where the Germans had made a breakthrough. They had attacked the 2nd 24th Battalion with a flame-throwing tank and fire and that sort of thing. And we could do nothing. I was in the next post, and I could do nothing to assist them otherwise than use the boys' anti-tank rifle to puncture the fuel tank of the flamethrower. But that is the only assistance we could render them. Well, about 2 o'clock the next morning, a young stretcher bearer made his way to my post from the post where the 24th had been attacked, looking for medical supplies and stuff. And I knew what had gone on, and I tried to talk him out of going back. But he said, "I must go back." And I was too young and inexperienced to make sure that I got his name and number, because if ever anybody deserved an award, that young man did. And the next morning, of course, when 8 or 9 fellows came out of that position and they were badly knocked about, I could understand why I had been so determined to stop him going back. But he did go back, and I'm sorry that I didn't remember his name and number to see that he got an award.
When you say that you punctured the flamethrower, this is the Germans?
Yes, when we punctured the fuel tank of the German flamethrower.
But when you say flamethrower, is this the one that a soldier's carrying?
No, this was a mechanised device with a long spout at the front like a cannon. Only this is where the flames came from. And the fuel tank was a carrier they towed behind. And that was what we punctured, hoping to have them run out of fuel. But of course it wasn't sufficiently big enough explosion to empty the tank quick enough to stop the flames.
What was the actual strategic importance of the salient?
Well, it was the first time the Germans had made a breakthrough and retained the position at Hill 209, and it gave them a breakthrough our lines into our defences. But they mined the area below them so heavily that neither us could get up to them or they could get down to us. And that was the closest to Tobruk that they got.
Was that a high position?
It was the highest position in the area, but it wasn't particularly high. It was called Hill 209. But, there was it was desert, and relatively the whole area was flat. At the bottom of the salient, we were instructed to move up to the bottom of the salient and dig slit trenches deep enough to contain us and roof them with sheets of iron or corrugated iron and put soil and tufts of whatever was growing there on top to camouflage them. And we were to lie in that position all that day and attack up the salient that night. Well, on our way up to the salient, earlier I had spoken about the young signaller that I had come across, and then I had left two of my men in this position and taken the others back with me to get these sheets of iron. And as we were going back, one of them, Keith Weisel, was a member of the ASC that, as I said earlier, had lost their transport and been sent to the infantry for the time being. And as I was walking back, I saw the flash under Keith's, under the fellow behind me, under his boot. And the next thing, there was an explosion, and the fellow behind me was Keith Weisel. He had stood on a booby trap, and the explosive charge blew up to chest height and exploded on the chest of Harry Parker and blew his head and shoulders off, and wounded Weisel in the back of the head with shrapnel and some of the other fellows behind him. I got a splattering of shrapnel in the back of my head, which for years later, every now and then one would come to the surface and my wife would dig it out. And so that I had to go forward then looking, because others had been wounded, I had to go forward then looking for stretcher bearers. And of course, with Keith having stood on a booby trap, and I'm moving forward through camel grass, which is stiff and not very high from the ground, and every bit that I touched, I imagined, was a jumping jack. Well, they say that cowards die 1,000 deaths and heroes die but one. Well, I was a coward that night because I died 1,000 deaths on the way back getting stretcher bearers, which I made my way through and also took them back. But as I say, I was scared stiff, but it's something that had to be done, and that was the case that you did the things that had to be done. You couldn't say, well, I don't want to go there, because I didn't want to go there, but I knew I had to. The prongs of these booby traps are probably 1.5 inches long, and the booby trap is buried in the ground, and all that's sticking up above it is these 3 little prongs. And you've got camel bush there that is stiff and hard and short like this, so that you don't know whether you're hitting the actual booby trap prongs or a bit of camel bush, so that you, every time you hit something, you imagine it is a booby trap, and you move forward and hoping to God it's not a booby trap and that it explodes out of the ground and spreads destruction all around it. You know, this of course took place at night, which made it all the worse because you couldn't see. Your fingers were your eyes and your nerves, and it was difficult to reconcile yourself to the fact that whatever you touched could be a booby trap that could explode and kill you and kill others. And I crawled forward through this area that was mined, and luckily I made my way through and got stretcher bearers and made my way back without disturbing any booby traps. And of course, I couldn't just walk back even though I'd crawled forward, because I couldn't imagine that there had been no booby traps there. So I had to crawl back by the same way and hoping that I didn't strike any booby traps on the way, and luckily I didn't. And I was able to get the stretcher bearers through to the other men that had been wounded in the initial explosion.
How big was this distance that you had to crawl?
It's difficult to say how far I had to crawl. Probably 20 yards, I suppose. It was at night, and it's probably felt twice as long as it actually was. And so that, and your imagination, of course, is working overtime at the same time as you're trying to convince yourself there's no booby traps there. Earlier I mentioned about coming across this young man, this signaller, and he was only a young man who couldn't have been over 20, because so many of us were so young. I was 19, and I think I was the youngest in my platoon, and I was a corporal. And at one stage, my fellows were going to jack up on me because they're all older than me, and I was very, well, I was upset about it because I thought I'd been doing my job reasonably well. But I told them if they didn't like it, to bugger off, and I could do without them. And one of my fellows, Horry St. Hilaire, said, "Good on you," what used he call me? Hooker. He said, "Good on you, Hooker, get up 'em." Because he was part of my section, and because I was young and he understood that, and he understood their point of view too, that they were older than me and should know better than I did. And Horry was telling me, Hooker, because I had stripes, and to get up 'em. And yes, the young signaller, Jack Dolner, his one name I've never forgotten because of his courage, that he was mortally wounded, but he was determined to tell everybody else not to touch the phone, which he thought was booby-trapped.
What kind of... And so Harry Parker was killed by the booby trap completely, correct?
Yeah, yes.
What kind of person was Harry Parker?
Harry Parker was a corporal from the ASC, and Harry was a fine type of young man. Keith Weisel also was a corporal from the ASC, and they both came to my section. Wonderful young men from a different state to me, and had no experience of infantry work, but they had to come into an infantry section at that time.
Do you remember anything about Harry Parker's personality?
Oh, no, just that he was a nice young man, easy to talk to, well-mannered young fellow, and quite a good soldier. Being Australians, of course, somebody asked you where you came from, and you'd say anything at all, such as they used to give false names and that at different times. But someone asked me one time where I came from, and I said, Bruloo. And I didn't know such a place existed. And years later, after the war, and going through maps, there actually was a Bruloo in the Central West. so that I didn't know my geography too well at that time.
What was the reason you guys would tell people fake places?
Or more or less just for fun, I suppose. Just having a go at them. Yeah, well, at one position we were in, there were 3 German tanks that had been knocked out. But the German recovery teams were coming at night trying to get them going again. And we had fired on these recovery teams. We couldn't see them. It was night and dark. But anyhow, Don Parker was our platoon commander at that time. And he sent back to the engineers asking them to come up and would they blow up these tanks. And the engineers said, that's not our job, the blowing up of tanks, but we'll send you 3 cases of gelignite and you fellas can do the job yourselves. Well, none of us had any ideas how to use gelignite, and it happened to be Italian romite, which was in a plug or a sausage-like affair and looked like aluminium filings and grease. So, and they sent up detonators and the explosive, the connecting wire from being lit to going to the detonator and exploding the gelignite. So Don decided we would go out and do this job ourselves. So Coog Kelly and Don and myself went out. Don took the furthest tank, and on the back of that tank was a 21-foot swastika flag. And I said, before we went out, I said, that flag's mine. And he said, righto. So he went to that tank and planted his case of gelignite in the driver's seat. I was doing the next tank, so I planted my case of gelignite in the driver's seat. We both run back to Coog, and he put his case of gelignite in the driver's seat, and we went back to a shell hole, laid there and lit cigarettes so we could light the fuse on the various bombs we had set up. So Don lit his and ran back to me and gave me a tap on the shoulder to let me know it, and I lit mine, and we both ran back to Coog and he lit his, and we went back to the shell hole and dived in, and the next thing there was this boom, and I said to Don, where's the flag? He said, I put it on the tank alongside you. Well, the next time there was a second explosion and away went my flag. And if I was to find it, I'd be looking for it yet. And parts of the tanks blew up and damn near lobbed on the shell hole where we were. But however, we got away with it and got out of it without being hurt. And those tanks wouldn't run again. With the recovery teams, the German recovery teams, we could only hear them. We couldn't see them. It was night time. So we had to fire by sound. Whether we killed any or wounded anything, I couldn't say, but there were no dead Germans there when we went to blow up the tanks. Up near the salient, when the Germans had taken that position, they had moved into an open area near that position, and one morning Jimmy Arnold, who I had spoken about earlier, that was hit by mortars when he went to the toilet, it was one of my Bren gunners, and he came to me about 5 o'clock in the morning and woke me and said, come and have a look at this. So I went with him to have a look, and here the Germans in this area were standing up, doing wheeze, shaking out blankets or covers or whatever they were, and they were under direct observation from my post. And Jimmy said, "What are you going to do?" Well, I said, "Nothing this morning, but we'll be up bloody early tomorrow." Well, the following morning we were up, and once the Germans got moving about, I gave the order to fire and we shot them down. And the poor buggers didn't have a clue that we had them under observation, and it was really more or less bloody murder.
How many Germans would you say there were?
Oh, I'd say 15 or 20. How many we wounded or killed, I don't know.
And how far away were the Germans, would you say?
Oh, a couple of 100 yards, I suppose.
I mean, you've been in combat. Is there any logical explanation why they would be so obvious about their movements?
Well, the only thing we could think that they had taken this position and were so confident that they'd cleared it out. They obviously didn't realise that we had them under observation. They may not have been aware that there were intermediate posts, which was what I was in at that time, an intermediate post. And they may not have been aware of that at all and thought that they were under cover from the next concrete post, so that they didn't really have an idea that we were looking at them or watching them.
What does that mean, an intermediate post?
The intermediate posts are the ones that I spoke of earlier, between the concrete posts, because the distance between the concrete posts we considered was too far apart to not have some protection in between to allow German patrols or troops to get through that area.
Can you tell me, when you were in combat, what would you say was the closest you got to the German infantry in a firefight?
Oh, feet away, I suppose.
And what incident was that?
Well, probably that was at Balimba. But and then, of course, when we were attacked, we walked in at night we were under an artillery barrage, but then the counter battery work came on, and we were walking through their shell fire and under ours. And that, you rushed up against dead Germans for that matter, or Germans who were wounded or killed. Balimba was the area of attack near Point 23, where eventually Montgomery made his breakthrough on the southern end of the front, where the weaker parts of the troops were. And we had been instructed to contain the Germans in the northern end of the front up towards the coast, to keep them combined up there to allow that attack to take place on the southern end, where it was Italian troops and the like, an easier area to attack.
And what do you actually remember about the combat that you experienced at Balimba, sir?
Oh, just that we went in, what shall I say, we got tangled up in barbed wire, and they were stronger than was anticipated, and they had reinforcements coming in. It should have been a brigade show instead of a battalion show, so that we were outgunned and outnumbered. But there's little you can do about it. You're in that area. And then when the colonel was wounded, one of the company commanders, Lance Bode, was killed. And he was one of the ones we thought was indestructible. And the CO went forward to take his place at head of his company, and he got wounded there. The 2IC, Colonel or Major Grace, came from the left out of battle area and took over. And when he saw the number of men that had been killed and we weren't advancing and the Germans were reinforcing that, he couldn't see the benefit of having more men killed for no gain. So he ordered a withdrawal against the will of the powers that be. And it cost him promotion for some 12 or 18 months. He eventually became our CO and got his extra pip to become a lieutenant colonel about 12 or 18 months later. The Germans were entrenched and behind wire and mines, and in a number of cases our fellows got entangled in wire and that, and it was difficult to get through, and the Germans were firing on us. We were losing quite a lot of men killed and wounded until such time as Grace ordered the withdrawal.
How do you navigate barbed wire?
Well, you've just got to go forward and the wire is there. You've got to get over it or through it or whatever, which is sometimes impossible.
Did you have any protection?
No.
On that note, if you could please explain to me your uniform when you're fighting in the desert. It seems that the Commonwealth soldiers wore shorts in the desert.
Yes, at night time you would be into your serge if you had it, because night times are bitterly cold. But generally speaking, shorts and shirt.
I mean, did you guys feel like that was adequate for combat, fighting in shorts?
Well, I don't suppose we ever gave a thought to any armour or armour plate or anything. That was it, that was our uniform, and that's where we were going.
What weapon did you carry in combat?
In general, I carried a Thompson submachine gun.
What did you think of the Thompson submachine gun?
Well, the Thompson was quite a good weapon, and the 45 stopped people, whereas the 9mm, such as the Germans used in their Spicers and that, didn't have the stopping power of the 45 from a Thompson, but a Thompson could be influenced by dirt and dust and that.
And what was the range of your Thompson submachine gun?
Accurate range would be 20 yards, I suppose.
Oh, wow. So it's really only good for close fighting.
Close fighting, yes.
Did you ever fire any other weapons besides the Thompson in combat?
Oh, yeah, I carried the rifle and
Which rifle was this?
303. And I also used the Bren.
When you say you used the Bren, are you talking about the incident with the plane, or there's another time?
Oh no, when it depended on the circumstance that somebody would grab the gun and fire at something, whether it was at planes or at infantry that you saw. But being daylight, you didn't see much, and at night time, of course, you were firing at the flash of their guns.
So when you were firing the Bren, it was mostly at night at the German, when you would see the German rifle fire.
Yes,
is that correct?
Quite often, yes.
Could you please explain how you left Tobruk and where you went?
Yes, we were relieved at Tobruk and withdrawn, and we came out on various destroyers. I came out on the Abdiel, which was the latest thing in the British Navy. Could do 40 knots. And the best part about it was they made their own bread and had fresh water on board. And matter of fact, we got on there, we got into the shower and had a shower and stood there with our mouth open and drank the shower water. And then you'd get a bit of fresh bread and butter. And there's nothing that tasted like it because we'd been on bully and biscuits for nearly the whole time we were there.
Talk to me about bully beef.
Well, the bully beef wasn't Australian. It was, I thought it was Argentinian, but I was talking to some Argentinian women years later, and they said, no, it wasn't. It was Venezuelan. So, but it wasn't Australian, that's for sure.
What did it taste like?
Oily, not very palatable or pleasurable. But still in all, that was what we had. And we had these hard biscuits. And the Italians left behind tablets of vegetable or herbs, something like our women folk had, compressed vegetables. But with the Italian ones, there was quite a bit of garlic in it. Well, that made a lot of difference to a bully beef stew. And we were picking those up out of the dirt for the Italians had left them. The same way as they left cigars that were dropped in the dirt. Well, we wiped them off and smoked them, but they were dry and burnt your throat, but it was still a smoke.
What was El Alamein, and what was your role at the Battle of El Alamein, Mr. Wallace?
El Alamein was the position about 38 or so miles from Alexandria in Egypt, and was the narrowest part between the coast and the Qatar Depression, which was a sea of sand, unpassable by vehicles. And so that was really the only position that the Eighth Army could take with any chance of holding the Germans out.
And talk to me about your role in the battle.
Well, initially I was still infantry with B Company, and then when they brought an anti-tank platoon into being, the CO asked for people who wanted to go into the anti-tank platoon, and he promoted me to sergeant, and I took over one of the anti-tank platoons, or as platoon sergeant. We had a company commander and a platoon commander who were officers, and we had 2 pounder anti-tank guns, which were more or less useless against the tanks because they were too small. But we were the anti-tank platoon, and that was our job.
Can you talk to me about, I understand that the anti-tank platoon and the infantry platoons are both on the front, but was there a difference in the amount of fire that you took on being in the anti-tank platoon versus being in an infantry platoon?
No, not really, because the firing was on the complete front, so that everybody copped it.
Can you talk to me about specific times that you remember the anti-tank guns being used against the German tanks?
No, not really, not the 2 pounders. they were useless as far as the tanks were concerned.
So how did you guys use them?
Well, it was, whatever targets we thought they were capable of doing damage to,
Such as?
or light armoured cars or dispatch riders and things like that. They were really, to be brutally frank, useless.
And then your role as a platoon sergeant, I mean, can you talk to me how you would set up the anti-tank guns or what you were in charge of as a platoon sergeant?
Well, you had to, well, in the case, as I said earlier, about the company commander and platoon officer being blown up, and I had to go forward and do a reconnaissance and put in guns. I would have had 4 guns under my control. Put in guns where you thought was a suitable position, which was, if you could get it, slightly back from a down-facing slope, so that you could get tanks coming up there, you would get a shot at their underbelly, the softest part.
So that has the underbelly of the German tanks had the least amount of armor.
That's right. Mm.
What did you all think of the actual German soldier? I mean, was there a hatred that you all had for the Germans?
No, we did not hate the Germans. They were young men doing what we were doing, thinking that they were doing the right thing by their country, just the same as we were. And the German frontline troops treated our troops the same as we treated them. And if you took them prisoner, you offered them a drink or a smoke. I took one group of 172 back to Egypt to put them into the prisoner of war cages there. And I went to put them into a cage with Italians, and quite definitely they weren't going in with the Italians. So we put them in the cage next door, and that gave us a chance. We had a night out of the line, we could have a bath, could wash our clothes, have a decent night's sleep. And on dusk, we went down to see how the jury prisoners were getting on, and they seemed to be doing all right. And one typical Aryan youth, he was a corporal, and one of our fellows down there said, "Hey Jerry, were you in the Hitler Youth Movement?" And quick as a flash he came back, he said, "No son, I was in the Salvation Army." So that...
in English?
In English, yes. And good English. Yeah, well, the prisoners that we took back were Germans, and it's, as I said, they didn't want to be mixed in with the Italians. They had their own sense of pride.
How many men did it take to transport 172 Germans back?
No.
I mean, was it just one person guarding them all?
No, just possibly half a platoon, I suppose.
Could you please tell me, the Battle of Alamein, a lot of people think that it started in October, or that was the main day.
That was the last battle.
So could you talk about what went on before that in general?
Well, as I said earlier, I tried to get the 8th Army clasp for the fellows that had been killed and wounded from the beginning of July when we arrived at Alamein until the 23rd of October when the last battle started. And they were men that had fought through that area and had been influential in improving the Allied side of it, and yet they were denied the 8th Army clasp, yet they were always part of the 8th Army, because we were under British command in 30 Corps, and so we were part of the 8th Army.
During the Battle of El Alamein, could you describe the scenes at night? What did it look like at night during the battle?
Oh, well, you had tremendous amount of illumination from behind because there was a 30-mile line of artillery, of Allied artillery, and there was German artillery as well, and you had your lights from there, and odd things like star shells and those sort of things taking place, so that there'd be flashes of light and you might see a tank moving or troops moving or something like that, you know. Well, Roy Parker was a friend of mine that came from Ellerish, where I was a lad porter. Roy was in his 30s, and when I joined up, I was on leave, and I walked back into camp one night and I saw this fellow sitting in the gutter there, and I looked down, he looked up, I thought, Jesus, Roy Parker. I said, what the hell are you doing here? He said, oh, I thought somebody better come down and keep an eye on you. So Roy and I were friends. We palled up together and we camped together and went on leave together. And he eventually got killed at Alamein, right near the end of the show.
Do you know the circumstances of what happened to him?
No, I was, as I say, I was in the anti-tank platoon, and I tried to get Roy to come into the anti-tank platoon with me, and he said, no, I'm too old to learn anything new. So he stayed in 12th platoon, and after one action, right near the end, I walked round to 12th platoon, and Ding Bell was the platoon sergeant, and Ding said, you're looking for Charlie, because they used to call him Charlie, because he reckoned that the reveille that we had at that time was calling out the 2IC, Charlie Barton. And I said, yes. He said, he just got killed. So he'd been killed probably by shell fire.
What kind of person was Roy Parker?
Oh, a solid, good sort of Australian.
Did he have any family?
Not that I know of. There had been an action the night before, and you get used to the fact that there are dead bodies that haven't been picked up the next morning, and I was walking around checking on my guns, and I saw this body on the ground, and I thought, oh, another dead German. And as I walked past, I glanced down, and it was a fellow I'd been on leave with not long before. So that, you're not aware of what's happening in other platoons or companies or that.
Did you write letters to any of the families of the men who were killed, or did you visit any of the families of the men who were killed when you came back to Australia?
No, I wrote to a couple of young ladies, and I wrote to my family, but that's all I did. There was one occasion where I picked up a wallet in Tobruk when I mentioned earlier that I had my fellows digging in near the Alamein Road, and I was doing a range card. I picked up this wallet and just stuffed it in my pocket. And later on, when I had done my range card, I picked out this wallet and opened it up, and here was a colour photo of a girl from Cairns, my hometown. And I said to Kelly, who came from Cairns also, I said to Kew, who's this? He said, Melvin Neville. He said, the secretary of the hospital. And of course, he was older than I was and she was. But anyhow, this wallet belonged to her fiancé. And I took the army papers, which I handed into company headquarters, and the personal stuff, including her photo, I sent home to my father to deliver to her. And Kirk said to me, "What are you going to do with the wallet?" I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, I've lost mine." I said, "Here, you've got a wallet." And a couple of months later, I got a letter from his fiancée, Melva Mantle, thanking me for sending them home. And luckily, he had sent her a cable the day after I picked up the wallet to say it was okay. So that eventually they married, and I was able to send the stuff home to her. Dad delivered it to her.
That's nice of you.
Oh, well, she was a Cairns girl, you know.
How do you find time to have compassion when you're fighting a war?
Well, that's one of the necessities if you're, what shall I say, a normal human being, that you have to show compassion, because you had the fellows that never got mail. Well, you had to bring them into the family, because most of the blokes with mail used to sort of tell one another about what was going on in their families. Well, you had to bring the fellows that had no mail, say to them, "Hey, Bill, look at this," or so-and-so, you know, to make them feel part of the family.
Was that common for some of the guys not to get mail?
Oh, I imagine it was quite hard. Billy Allen was a young fellow in my platoon, and when we were moving up into a position, he was riding up on top of the Porte, which was the truck that carried the anti-tank gun, and he got killed when he was moving up to the front.
What do you remember about Billy Allen?
Oh, not a great deal, just a young fellow, and quite a nice young fellow, and quite popular with everybody.
How old would you say he was, roughly?
Oh, Billy would be 19 or 20, I suppose.
So, continuing on, could you please tell me about the training that you received in preparation for New Guinea?
Well, we came home to Australia, and we had 3 weeks leave, and then went into camp at Kurai on the Atherton Tablelands, and there we started jungle training, having to build our own assault courses and go into training for jungle training as best we could, because it was quite heavy scrub in that area. And eventually 2 other sergeants and myself were sent over to an Australian artillery regiment to put them through jungle training. And we stayed there for possibly a week or something. They had to build their own assault course, and we ran them through it. And when we used to go into the sergeant's mess for meals or that, they used to say, "Here come those over-healthy infantry bastards." And many years later, I got a new bank manager in Cairns, and I was in the bank one day, and this chap came out and told me he was the new manager. And he said, "I've got an idea, I know you." I said, "Where do you come from?" He said, "Western Australia." I said, "Oh, I don't think so." So sometime later I was in the bank again, and he said to me, "Were you in the army?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Did you ever go and train a artillery regiment in jungle training?" I said, yes, I did, with 2 other sergeants. He said, I knew bloody well I knew you. He said, you're one of those over-healthy infantry bastards. And, but it paid off, because when my first wife died, he thought at first it was my stepmother. When he realised it was my wife, he went into the bank and changed our account. And he rang me up and he said to me, don't sign any more cheques, WG and AE Wallace. It's been WG Wallace since last Friday, the day before my wife died, which saved me a lot of trouble with the curator and that. So that it's handy to know someone, you know.
Could you please tell me, sir, you had all been fighting the Germans in North Africa.
Mm-hmm.
What had you been told about the Japanese? And when you went through the jungle training, what were the actual tactics that you learned when it comes to fighting an enemy like the Japanese?
Well, when we were told the Japanese were very, they were efficient and aggressive, and that they were up to all sorts of tricks, like with booby traps and snipers up in palm trees, so that your forward scouts could quite often get killed before being able to warn their body of troops that they were the scout for. But we were confident that we could beat the Japanese.
Could you tell me, did you actually encounter Japanese snipers personally when you were in New Guinea?
Oh, they were there, yes, but I was never a forward scout, but I had to send fellows to be forward scouts. But generally speaking, we sort of managed to make our way forward without a lot of trouble. The case was that your eyes and ears were your most important part of your equipment. And, you couldn't just rush into a situation and assume that such and such would happen, because you're up against an enemy entirely different in an atmosphere completely different.
Can you talk to me about the landing at Leh?
Yes, the landing at Leh was not heavily opposed, so that we came ashore quite strongly, and the Japanese withdrew, and we then turned to the left to get across the Buso River, I think it was the Buso, which was in flood, to go into Leh, the township itself. Well, then we got a call over the radio from the 7th Div to stop shooting at them. And they had come through the Ramu Valley on land, and they had beaten us into Leh by about 15 minutes. And the Japanese had withdrawn from the area. So from there, we then went to the landing at Finchhafen at Scarlet Beach, and the Yanks landed members of our brigade in a different place to where they should have been. So it ended up with a company of the 13th and a company of the 17th and a company of the 15th becoming enmeshed together, and it said a lot for their training that they worked together quite well at that landing and held the beach for the rest to land. And the Japanese tried to come in behind us in barges behind us. Well, a young American fellow on a 50 caliber gun won the Medal of Honor there, but he was killed by the Japanese in repelling these barges behind us. One fellow on a bulldozer that landed, and he had a number of photographs taken of him and an Air Force chap and some woman going through a few sexual manoeuvres, and he's showing everybody these photos. And I said, "What are you going to do with the photos?" "I don't know." "Why?" I said, "Well, you're not going to have them sent home if you get killed, are you?" "Oh," he said, "Never thought about that." So that whether he got rid of them or not, I don't know. Oh yes, with the bulldozer, he was moving forward and a Japanese machine gun post firing on him, and he put up the blade and charged the post and bulldozed them over. After Finchhaven, we were moving up the north coast, and I was the lead platoon for the division at that stage, and we came across this Jap RAP post, if you could call it such. There was dead Japanese bodies tied to logs or sticks where they'd been carried without stretchers, and some of them were lying in this stream. And then our battalion fellows moved up into position down to the right of us towards the coast where the water was running that way. And when we went down to join them, we waited until they were boiling their bellies with the water taken out of the stream, and then told them about the Japanese dead lying in the water upstream from them. Of course, we weren't very popular, but they're the sort of things that you do.
What is an RAP post?
An RAP is a regimental aid post. That's your medical post.
And could you please tell me, when you were in New Guinea, I know you came home earlier because you didn't go to Borneo.
No, I didn't go to Borneo.
But when you were in New Guinea, do you remember any of the firefights that you got into against the Japanese? You were still in the anti-tank platoon, right?
Yes, but we were acting as an infantry platoon because there was no tanks to worry about. At Alamein, I was involved in a circumstance which I was not proud of later on, but however I thought it was our ration truck had got lost and was coming from the enemy side. When I realised it was not our ration truck, I then thought it was lorried enemy infantry, and they pulled up a short distance from my position. It was dusk, so they could not see me, but two men got out and walked towards my position. And one of them called out something in German, which I didn't understand, but I realised they were Germans, so I shot one and killed him, and then I shot the other one, and he was badly wounded, and he fell to the ground, and he started screaming for his mother and family, and he was in a bad way. So I moved forward then to see who they were or what they were, and I had already called out to the section next to me, and they were firing on the back of this truck, as they thought it was light infantry as well. And I got to this chap and went through his pockets for any intelligence I could find, and eventually I sorted out the army stuff, and then I came across this photo of his wife and two girls. Well, I hated myself to think that I had killed those children's father. And the truck above us started to explode with all these artillery shells, and I hit the ground with this fellow, and he was desperately calling for assistance or for home, And I held his hand. I was under there for a couple of hours with him while this truck exploded over our head. And I held his hand while he died. And I felt so dreadful about the fact I'd killed his children's father. And eventually, years later, I wrote a poem about it called Cairo, because he remained in my memory. And one of my mates, one of my men called Sid Blinko, had said to me, "Finish him off." Well, it was all right while they were standing, but when they were down on the ground, as far as I was concerned, it was murder. So I wasn't prepared to finish him off in that respect, and I held him hand until he died. Well, then, years later, when I wrote this poem about it, because he stayed in my mind, and I think it was 1959 before I wrote this poem, but it always stayed in my mind. So I would like to read you this poem so you'll understand how I felt about it. This is a poem I wrote in 1959. Cairo. Cairo, I once went there, a young Aussie soldier. For those who remember, you helped pay the fare. The trip wasn't wasted. After all, we did win. Or did we, I ponder? It now seems a sin to kill fellow humans, young boys just as we, there with the same purpose and maybe kill me. One face I remember, I dream. He carried their photo, his wife and two girls. God, they'd both be mothers, have boys of their own, and I killed their father. How could I have known my thinking would alter? I'd mellow with age. How futile the practice, how stupid the rage. We were both boys who should have been friends and shared woe and joys. Cairo, no thank you. The memory still stays. I dream of the desert and those far-off days. I grieve for a German I killed as a boy. The memories are bitter. Forgive me, my friend.
That was beautiful. Thank you, sir.
Yes, that truck I was speaking about was full of artillery ammunition, and quite obviously they had got lost. They were probably intending it to deliver it to an artillery position, an enemy artillery position. So I suppose I saved a lot of shells from dropping on us, but they exploded over our head while I was there with this German officer. But he stayed with me, and I always think about the two girls and the fact that, of course, they'd be old ladies now, and their children would be probably married. But it was just the fact that to kill him just outright while he was lying on the ground, to my opinion, was murder.
Can you explain to me, when the truck was going off and the shells were going off, the reason you didn't leave the area is because you wanted to stay with the German?
No, it was because it had been too dangerous. What I mean, there was parts of shells flying hell west and crooked, so I would have ended up getting killed getting back to my position.
If you had got up.
And so I stayed there with him and held his hand for the fact that the poor bugger was dying and had no one.
There was were you saying anything to him?
No, not really. I couldn't speak German, and he was just crying for whoever. Well, generally firefights took place in daylight, but you were not moving about in daylight except in New Guinea, in the jungle, because it's more or less impossible to work through the jungle at night. But you get the idea of whether you've hit someone because you zero in your rifle and you know exactly where it's firing, and you do that simply because you want to be able to hit the enemy. That's what we were there for. And it's a factor that I was a reasonably good shot, and you get fellows that shoot with both eyes open. Well, I couldn't do that, but I was a natural left-hand shot, and I had to learn to shoot right-handed to do rapid fire. But if I really wanted to hit something, I went back to the left shoulder. It all depends on the visibility, but sometimes you know damn well you've hit them. Whether you've killed them or not, you don't know. But in the same way as I mentioned earlier about the fact of when we were observing them through Hessian, and they were observing us, but they weren't behind any Hessian, you could see the reflection from their faces, and you fired at those reflections. And the Germans at that time, or after the war, commented on our snipers. Well, we didn't actually have snipers. It was just fellows having a go, and most of them were, or a lot of them were country kids, were good shots, and had been in touch with rifles most of their life.
Could you talk to me about the patrols that you went on in no man's land during the siege of Tobruk? What would a typical patrol consist of?
Well, normally a patrol would probably consist of a section, if it was a observation patrol or a intelligence collection. But if it was a fighting patrol, of course, it would be a platoon or stronger strength to carry out the attack. And as I said before, we navigated our way across no man's land by moving to where the German fixed lines were, wait till they fired, and then move across. So that's how we made our way across no man's land at night.
Do you remember any of the specific fighting patrols that you were on at Tobruk?
No, but I do remember a situation where I was on a listening patrol, which you're lying out there probably 100 yards in front of our lines, and you were listening for any enemy movement. And there was what was obviously a fighting patrol of about platoon strength that went to ground not very far in front of my patrol that I had out there. And just as I went on, I presumed it was enemy because I didn't know of any information about a fighting patrol from our own side going out. So I saw them go to ground, and a man posted at each corner of this group, which I imagine were sentries, and then two people got together talking. So I presumed one was the platoon leader and the other was platoon sergeant. Then the sergeant went away, and I had said to my fellows, I sent one fellow back in to tell the platoon commander that I was being stuck into an enemy patrol, and I said to my fellows, 2 grenades each and into them with a bayonet. And I'd sent this bloke in to tell the platoon commander what I was going to do, and luckily a fellow came out to me, and one of my fellows was lying there with his rifle and bayonet pointed back towards our lines, and this fellow nearly stepped onto him. He said, "Oh, Jesus Christ." And I said, "Who are you?" And he told me he was a sergeant from another company. I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "We're on a fighting patrol and we got lost." And I said, "Is that your patrol out there?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Jesus Christ," I said, "I'm glad you came back before Anderson." I said, "I told my blokes 2 grenades each in India's." And he said, "You fair dinkum?" I said, "Bloody oath." I said, "We're well within grenade range." So he went on to his platoon, this fighting patrol, and spoke to his officer. And the officer said to him, "Bullshit." And he called out to me, "Gordon, stand up." I stood out, and he realised how close I was to them. So by then I would probably been the most disreputable soldier in the Australian Army if I'd have killed our own people.
Yeah.
But it shows how dangerous it can be when you don't have the information.
Or the visibility.
No visibility, no.
Could you...
And in New Guinea, I was sent out in a patrol to check out a certain area where they thought there was Japanese. And a sergeant from the Papuan Infantry Battalion asked to go with me. And my company commander said to me, "He's not to be committed to action." So we went, and the Japanese fired on us in this position, and we were into them. And this sergeant, as far as keeping him out of action, we weren't in the race. He was into it and he got shot in the stomach. And I thought, well, I'll be in tin well and truly when we get back. But we carried him back on a stretcher that we made up with rifles and shirts. And the Papuan Infantry Battalion mob thought we were wonderful, the fact that we'd carried a native soldier back on a stretcher for assistance. And I never thought otherwise, but I knew I was in trouble because I'd allowed him to join the action. Well, I couldn't do much about it because I was into it myself. And so that I got a good blasting, but he survived. And so after all, most things turned out okay. The Papuan soldier wanted a drink. Well, we knew we couldn't give him a drink because he had a stomach wound and it could have done him more harm than good. Although he moistened his lips, but that's all we could do for him.
In that action in which you fired against the Japanese, I mean, do you remember how close the Japanese were?
Oh, yes, we were within yards of them. We were within yards of the Japs, and they were fired out because we were looking for them, but we didn't realise they were just where they were. Luckily, the only person who got hit in our mob was the Papuan sergeant, the only one that we didn't want to be hit. Wes Sally was a sergeant in our battalion, and he was a damn good soldier. And when we were trying to take Finschhafen, he was moving across the area below the cliffs or the rise where the Japanese were up on top, and he got killed moving through there looking for a way to get up there. And eventually, as I said earlier, our troops scaled that rise by hanging onto vines and pulling themselves up, and eventually they took the position.
Could you please tell me about Washing Machine Charlie? What was Washing Machine Charlie?
Washing Machine Charlie was a small Japanese plane that sounded like nothing much. It was so light, and we, more or less, somebody said it sounded like a washing machine. And they used to come out and throw out small bombs. And I had one of my fellows killed by one of these bombs. The next morning when we got up, somebody said, "Where's Bill?" And so I said, "So go and wake him up." They went and he was dead. And when we looked at him, he had a point of blood about the size of a match head on his chest, and a piece of shrapnel for one of those bombs must have gone straight into his heart and killed him. And we didn't know anything about it. We're just at this, we're that used to this light plane coming over and throwing out bombs. And we never actually had any idea.
Okay, sir. What life advice do you want to give to future generations?
Well, to future generations, I think we should restrain our troops to our own country for the defence of our own country, because except on one occasion, we've always fought for some other country and for their benefit. And we have got very little out of it. War debts and things like that.
Your great-great-great-great-grandkids, what do you want them to know for their lives?
Well, I sincerely hope the young people are smart enough to say to the politicians when they're talking war that it is not going to happen.
If you were to give me some advice for my life, what would you tell me?
Well, I would say, how old are you?
21.
21. Well, I would say enjoy your life. 21, you're now legally able to vote and drink and whatever you want to do. Find yourself a nice girl and have a family and live a normal life. Teach your children their manners and courtesies, and let's get back to a simple life of good behaviour, good manners, and, to realise that there are other people out there in a worse position than you are.
Thank you for that.
It's all right.
Were you afraid of getting killed when you were in combat? Did you think about the fact that
No.
you would get killed? You could get killed?
Like so many of the others, it wasn't going to happen to me. But with some it did.
Are you afraid of death now?
No.
Why not?
Well, I've met death, and I'm not afraid of death. I never have been. I didn't know if I was ever going to make it to your age, 21, but look at I've gone now.
You're going to make it over 100.
Well, I wouldn't bet on it, but at the same time,
Knock on wood. I'm going to pray that you make it over 100. I mean it. I hope you do. You deserve it.
Well, to be perfectly honest, I pray every night, but I pray for a cure for Parkinson's, so that Trish might have the rest of life without this bloody Parkinson's,
You sound like a typical World War II combat veteran. It's always about other people.
Well, what I mean, we could never complain. We volunteered.
I know, but can you explain that, though? That this is one very unique thing. I've come across every single combat veteran from all the different countries. The way that they live their lives, whether even before the war. Your generation, it seems, specifically the combat veterans, they have a mentality of doing things for other people. It's always about helping other people.
Well,
why?
Well, it's the way we were brought up. It's a fair go for everybody. And if you can assist somebody, well, what's wrong with it? It's better assisting them than hurting them.
What do you believe happens after a person passes away?
Well, I believe the soul goes on. Whether it goes into another body or not, I don't know. Whether God is God as a person or a being, or whether it's nature. I'm inclined to think it's nature, because summer, autumn, winter and spring happen without any any human assistance. The moon and sun rise and go around without any human assistance. You get those beautiful rose-coloured moons now and then, and you look at the sky when it's clear and there's no sound, and you can see the stars, and it's so brilliant. That was one of the things in the desert, when you could look up there into the northern hemisphere, and we didn't know anything about the stars there, and we knew that the North Star we had to know. And, it's just, what shall I say? It's just something, there's so much beauty out there that you can look at and believe in and think. Well, I can quite honestly say that I've been on patrol and lying out in the desert and looking at those stars and thinking to myself, Jesus, it's great to be alive. And I wasn't 20 then, but it was just lovely to be alive, There's so much beautiful stuff in the world, and so many wonderful things to do, Like I write poetry, I read and read and read, and I don't know, I go to functions like when the Rats were going, we had Rats at Tobruk Memorial Schools. Well, when we closed down, what finances we had, we split up between these various schools. And the museum at Nambour, we gave that money to them because it's a volunteer affair and has such a lot of stuff to do with our battalion. And I am committing our battalion banner and the 9 Div banner to the Nambour Museum. But that's me, an ordinary person that's been brought up properly, until I was 14. My mother taught me about religion, and it sort of stayed with me. And I hear and see 6 now, but I used to be 7, young men ringing my wife and speaking to her about any damn thing on earth. And my eldest son, who died, always reckoned that Trish was the linchpin between the two families, my first 4 boys and our 4. And it's definitely a fact, and the kids all think that Grandma is Christmas on a stick.
She is very nice.
She is, well, I can tell you quite honestly, and I married a beautiful woman, my first wife, and she was a wonderful woman just like this one, only that I have grown up with this lady. I have grown to be a better person, and with Trish, because she's such just a wonderful, generous person with everything.
What would you want to say to all the men who were killed overseas in the war? What would you want them to know?
Want them to know we've never forgotten them. We are intensely proud of their friendship and the fact that we served with them.
What kind of person do you want to be remembered as, Mr. Wallace?
Well, just as a decent, ordinary person. I hope my kids and my grandkids all think Poppy's not too bad a bloke. Just the fact that I've done the right thing by them to the best of my ability, and that they still regard me, love me as a father or grandfather.
What is the best way for the people of this planet to pay tribute to the men who were killed in World War II? What can we do?
I don't think the only thing you can do is remember them and assist any of their families that need assistance. And remember them as decent people. As I said to you, I had some... Wait a while, I'll see if I can find it. I'll give you some idea of what I used to speak about and what I remember. I hope I can find them. And our mum's... I won't get in here and find out what we've got. No, that's not them. I've got that much stuff in here, I don't know if I've got the stuff I'm looking for. Oh yes, here we are. These are crypt addresses. This was 2009.
Do me a favor, so just sit back a little bit if you're still able.
Oh,
Are you still able to see it? Is the lighting okay?
I welcome you this morning, yes, to our annual service here in the crypt where the memorial tablets to the 315th Battalions are placed. Each time I walk within this place, I am minded of the abbeys, the churches, and the castles of Great Britain, and the knight's shields and colours which are displayed on the walls of these places, and I find myself thinking that these tablets or plaques placed here are the knight's shields of the members of our 3 battalions and the men and boys of those battalions who also won their spurs of knighthood in battle. I also always feel so proud of my association with the men and boys who offer themselves, I always feel so proud of my association with them, who offer them in defence of their country and the empire as it existed, and know quite simply that no knights deserve the accolade of knighthood any more than these of our friends and relations who paid the highest price for their honour, and those who survived after offering the same gift of sacrifice, and whose offer was not taken up at that time. So it is with a great deal of pride and respect for those of our own who are not present that I offer you the privilege of placing your wreaths on the appropriate tablet of the unit you wish to honour.
That was beautiful.
Well, they're the sort of things I speak about.
Could you please tell me about the origin of the name Rats of Tobruk?
Well, the name Rats of Tobruk was brought about by a British traitor called William Joyce, who broadcast for Germany, and he was called Lord Haw-Haw because of his British accent. He had quite often had good intelligence, which we didn't know about, so we found out things from him, whether he realised we did or not. And he reckoned we were living like rats in holes in the ground, and that we were actually prisoners of war. Well, of course, we proved that differently, but that's where the name comes from. And so being Australians had turned things like that round into something of pride, they said they were quite happy to call themselves the Rats of Tobruk. Well, my father didn't know I had joined up, and when I came home on pre-em leave, which meant when I went back I'd be going overseas, he tried to talk me out of it. And I said, well, if you try to do anything about it, I'll go under a different name. And that's what happened. He didn't want me to go under a different name, so I went as it was.
When you came home, did you talk about your experiences with him?
He never talked about his either. No man's land. There's a piece of land in every war that seems to be all we're fighting for. Fenced on both sides with barbed wire and mines that separates the opposing lines. No one lays claim to it by day. Unoccupied, vacant and fallow it lay. The harvest is reaped most every night when patrols from both sides claim it by right. It's a patch of earth that divides armies into different sides. By daylight it's a killing field, by night its secrets are revealed, where trespassers are killed or harmed by an enemy who's been alarmed by jangling tins filled with stones, by booby traps and wounded's moans. A dangerous, unforgiving ground where wire, shell holes and mines abound, and when no light comes from the skies, your fingers soon become your eyes, the ability to know by touch and feel what is fake and what is real. Is it camel bush or a booby trap springs or a telephone wire where no wire belongs? To go out there and to return is something we all need to learn. Direction finding, that's the skill that shows you, that allows you to move and to fulfill the most important fact-finding role, which you are out there on patrol. If you survive war's harsh demand, you're a veteran then of no man's land.
Perfect. And then there was one incident where you would hit the ground and another man had hit the ground and he told you, do not move your foot.
Yes.
Because your foot was next to a mine?
Yes, it was on a mine.
So how did you get out of that situation?
Well, when I realised that my foot was on the mine, I told him to get the hell out of it. And very, very cautiously I withdrew my foot over to Christ. The mine wouldn't go off, and it didn't.
So your foot was literally, when you hit the ground, it landed on a mine.
Yeah.
But it didn't set it off.
Right. You see, they're what we call the Jippo mines. They were made in Egypt. And if they didn't have the lead shear pin, they were just liable to put a wooden match in there. Well, you can imagine how safe that would be. So they're the sort of things that we didn't know about.
But what were you doing when you guys hit the ground?
Oh, well, we had gone to get one of the few hot meals that we had got while we were in the front line. I had taken two fellows with me, Jack Sandovan and this chap named, was it Armstrong? I've forgotten his name. Anyhow, we were going through this path through a minefield, and we must have been skylined by the Germans. So they got into us mortars. Well, I was in the middle with holding the handles of dixies of food, and they were holding the same handles there, and they also had an extra one on the outside on their other hands. Well, this fellow on my right, when the mortar started, instead of hitting the dirt, he panicked and run. He skied the Dixie of food and ran. And Jack Sandover and I both hit the dirt. Well, my foot landed on a mine. So that eventually, when it was over, we got up. We were short one Dixie of food, and the food wasn't hot when we got there. It was cold, but it was one of the few prepared meals we had while we were up the line.
Just explain what we're looking at.
Oh, well, you're looking at a photo of me, a young corporal in Tobruk, with a head of hair. It obviously was a shortage of scissors or barbers at that particular time. And the fellow in with me is Bill Devonshire, who was my runner at that time.
Do you remember this photo being taken?
No, I don't. I imagine it was the company commander that took it.
What is that a photo of?
Oh, this is a photo taken it would be at Idlib in Syria. The first time we'd struck snow, being Queenslanders, we'd never seen snow. So that was the first time we'd seen snow, was on our march to Idlib.
And what is this?
And this is taken in Red Bank, not long after we joined up, during a smoko break from training.
Which one are you?
I'm the one with the milk bottle that's spilling down my chin.
And what is this, sir?
And this is a photo taken by a street photographer of me in Palestine, and a photo of my first wife. Before we were married, she was my girlfriend at that time.
And could you just explain this photo and how he was the youngest one and what happened to him?
Yes, this photo was taken in Tobruk. It was the time when, that would have been August in 1941, when the Poles came in, because you'll notice there is a Polish soldier in the back, and the only one I knew that was younger than me was Alamein, who was on the right-hand, second from the right-hand end, I think, isn't it? Second from the right-hand end. Alamein was later killed on the beach at Alamein. They had gone for a swim and the Germans shelled the beach, and he was killed then.
Now, you were an NCO and a very young one.
Yeah.
What was that like, giving orders to men who were older than you?
Well, it was, well, I just had to be sure of myself that I was better than they were at the use of weapons and things like that, and that I was, with shooting or anything else, I had to be the top